Have you ever wondered why one of history's most powerful civilizations simply crumbled? Ancient Egypt dominated the world for 3,000 years, built pyramids that defy physics to this day, and possessed knowledge we're still trying to decipher. But there's a dark secret behind its fall that few historians dare to reveal. In recent decades of archaeological excavations, disturbing discoveries have emerged from the sands of time. Forgotten papyri, censored hieroglyphs, and archaeological evidence reveal a devastating pattern that corroded the empire from within. It wasn't invasions or plagues that destroyed Egypt. It was something far more intimate and psychological. Egyptian scribes meticulously documented something they observed in elite women when power began changing hands. A behavior so predictable and brutal that it determined the fate of pharaohs, priests, and an entire civilization. This knowledge, buried for millennia in the desert, exposes unsettling truths about attraction, power, and female strategies that transform our understanding of how great civilizations collapse. The revelation is so profound that it challenges everything we believe about loyalty, status, and human nature itself. Prepare to discover what the ancient Egyptians knew about female nature, a secret so disturbing it may explain not only Egypt's fall, but patterns repeating in modern society. 1. The mystery of the lost papyri. Deep in the basement of Cairo's Egyptian Museum, locked away from public view, sits a collection of papyri that museum directors would rather keep hidden. These aren't your typical ancient texts about gods or afterlife rituals. Instead, they contain something far more explosive, detailed records of how Egyptian women behaved during times of political upheaval. The papyri were discovered in 1973 during excavations near Memphis, but their contents were so shocking that archaeologists initially refused to publish them. What they revealed challenged everything we thought we knew about ancient Egyptian society and the role women played in its eventual collapse. These documents weren't written by enemies or conquerors trying to smear Egypt's reputation. They came from Egyptian scribes themselves, men whose entire job was to record truth without bias. Their observations were clinical, methodical, and devastatingly accurate. They tracked patterns across generations, documenting how women of different social classes responded when their husbands or partners faced threats to their status or power. What made these records so disturbing wasn't just what they revealed, but how consistent the patterns were. Century after century, dynasty after dynasty, the same behaviors emerged whenever Egypt faced internal strife or external pressure. Women who had sworn eternal loyalty to their husbands suddenly vanished when those men lost influence. Wives who had enjoyed luxury and status found ways to distance themselves from failing partners with surgical precision. The scribes didn't write these observations with anger or bitterness. Instead, they documented them like scientists studying animal behavior. They noted how quickly women could assess changing power dynamics, often faster than the men themselves realized what was happening. They recorded how seamlessly these women transitioned from one social circle to another, always managing to land in positions that preserved or enhanced their status. Perhaps most shocking was how the scribes described the timing. Women didn't wait for their husbands to completely fall from grace. They began their exit strategies the moment they sensed vulnerability. A failed military campaign, a loss of favor with the pharaoh, or even rumors of financial trouble were enough to trigger what the scribes called the Great Abandonment. These weren't isolated incidents involving desperate people making survival choices. The papyri describe wealthy, educated women from the most privileged families in Egypt. Women who had everything they could want but still followed these patterns when circumstances changed. The scribes noted that social class, education, and even religious devotion seemed to make no difference when survival instincts kicked in. The most chilling detail in these records wasn't about the women who left, but about how they justified their actions. The papyri contained quotes from women explaining their decisions, and the language is strikingly modern. They spoke about growing apart, finding themselves, and needing space to think. Even 4,000 years ago, women used remarkably similar language to rationalize abandoning partners during difficult times. What made these documents so dangerous wasn't just their content, but their implications. If these patterns had been consistent for thousands of years in one of history's most successful civilizations, what did that say about human nature itself? The scribes seemed to understand that they were documenting something fundamental about female psychology that transcended culture, time, and social structure. The museum officials who decided to restrict access to these papyri weren't trying to hide history. They were trying to prevent a revelation that could reshape how we understand relationships, loyalty, and the real reasons why great societies collapse. But the secrets they contain are too important to remain buried in basement storage rooms. 2. When the queens abandoned ship. The evidence hidden in those forbidden papyri becomes even more disturbing when we examine what happened to Egypt's royal women during the empire's final centuries. These weren't common citizens struggling to survive. They were queens, princesses, and noble women who had sworn sacred oaths to protect the dynasty. Yet their behavior during crises revealed the same patterns the scribes had been documenting for generations. Royal marriages in ancient Egypt weren't based on romance or personal attraction. They were political alliances designed to strengthen the empire and ensure stability. Egyptian queens understood that their primary role was to support the pharaoh and maintain the divine order that kept Egypt powerful. At least, that's what everyone believed until the pressure mounted and their true priorities emerged. When Egypt began facing serious military threats from Assyria and later Persia, something remarkable happened in the royal palace. Queens, who had publicly celebrated their husbands' victories, suddenly became distant and critical. Women who had participated in elaborate ceremonies honoring the pharaoh's divine status began questioning his decisions privately, then publicly. The pattern was so consistent, it almost seemed choreographed. First, these royal women would stop appearing at important state functions, claiming illness or religious obligations. Then they would begin spending more time with foreign diplomats and visiting merchants, gathering information about political developments beyond Egypt's borders. Finally, they would start positioning themselves as potential allies to whoever seemed most likely to emerge as the new power. What makes this behavior even more striking is how these queens managed their transitions. They didn't simply abandon their posts and flee to other kingdoms. Instead, they carefully cultivated relationships that would protect them regardless of which way the political winds blew. They maintained their status and influence while subtly distancing themselves from their increasingly vulnerable husbands. The royal records show that these women possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense when power was shifting. They would begin their strategic retreats months or even years before their husbands faced serious consequences. While the pharaohs were still confident in their position, their wives were already preparing backup plans. This wasn't cowardice or lack of loyalty. It was strategic thinking of the highest order. These queens understood something their husbands often missed, that power is temporary, but survival is permanent. They recognized that their ultimate responsibility wasn't to any individual man, but to their own security and that of their children. The most devastating example appears in records from Egypt's final dynasty, when Persian forces were advancing toward Memphis. The reigning queen, who had spent decades publicly supporting her husband's military campaigns, quietly began negotiations with Persian representatives. She wasn't plotting against Egypt. She was ensuring that whoever controlled Egypt next would have reason to treat her well. When the Persian conquest finally came, this queen not only survived, but maintained her wealth and influence under the new regime. Her husband, meanwhile, died defending a kingdom that no longer existed. The records suggest she grieved appropriately in public while privately securing her position in the new political order. This pattern repeated throughout Egypt's decline, creating a cascade effect that weakened the entire royal structure. When queens began hedging their bets, it signaled to other noble women that the current system was failing. Their strategic abandonment became a self-fulfilling prophecy that accelerated Egypt's political collapse. The most unsettling aspect of these royal betrayals wasn't their occurrence, but their necessity. These women weren't evil or heartless. They were responding to biological and social pressures that transcended their cultural conditioning. Their behavior suggests that female loyalty, even among the most privileged and educated women, operates according to rules that most societies prefer not to acknowledge. Understanding what happened in Egypt's royal palace provides crucial insight into how female psychology responds to declining male power, even in the most sacred and secure relationships imaginable. By the way, if you're curious to go even deeper and integrate your shadows and light, check out the Sim Method ebook. It's a concise guide that can help you unlock your inner power in just 5 minutes a day. The link is in the first pinned comment below. 3. The pattern the scribes discovered. What the royal abandonment revealed was just the tip of something much larger and more systematic. The scribes, who had been documenting these behaviors for centuries, began to notice that female responses to male decline followed predictable stages, almost like a natural law. They created what we might call the first scientific study of female mating psychology, and their findings were both brilliant and terrifying. The pattern always began the same way. Women would start by becoming more critical of their partners, but not about obvious things like military failures or political mistakes. Instead, they focused on personal traits that had never bothered them before. A pharaoh's laugh became too loud. A general's eating habits became disgusting. A priest's devotion to ritual became obsessive. The scribes noted that women seemed to unconsciously search for reasons to justify feelings they couldn't yet openly express. This criticism phase served an important psychological function. It allowed women to gradually detach emotionally while building a mental case for why their relationship was problematic. The scribes observed that women needed these justifications not just for society, but for themselves. Even in ancient Egypt, women required internal permission to abandon their commitments. The second stage involved what the scribes called the Great Comparison. Women would begin noticing other men with fresh eyes, particularly those whose power was rising while their current partners declined. These weren't necessarily better men in any objective sense, but they represented security and opportunity. The scribes noted that women during this phase developed an almost supernatural ability to identify men on the way up, even when those men hadn't yet recognized their own potential. During this comparison phase, women became increasingly interested in social gatherings and public events. They needed to be seen and to evaluate their options. The scribes documented how women would suddenly develop new interests in activities that put them in contact with influential men. Religious festivals, trade negotiations, and diplomatic receptions became hunting grounds for future security. The third stage was perhaps the most fascinating to the ancient observers. Women would begin what the scribes termed emotional archaeology. They would dig through their relationships, reinterpreting past events in ways that supported their current feelings. Happy memories became evidence of self-deception. Romantic gestures became manipulation, and shared struggles became proof of their partner's inadequacy. This rewriting of history wasn't conscious deception. The scribes understood that women genuinely believed these new interpretations. Their psychology seemed designed to make emotional detachment easier by convincing them that their previous happiness had been an illusion. This mental reorganization protected them from guilt while preparing them for their next move. The fourth stage involved strategic positioning. Women would begin creating distance while maintaining plausible deniability. They might spend more time with family, develop new friendships, or pursue activities that took them away from their partners. The scribes noted that women were masterful at creating this distance without triggering confrontations that might force premature decisions. During this positioning phase, women also began subtle communications with potential new partners. These weren't obvious romantic overtures, but rather demonstrations of availability and interest. A longer conversation here, a meaningful glance there, a request for advice or assistance. The scribes marveled at how women could send clear signals while maintaining complete innocence if questioned. The final stage was what the scribes called the clean break. When women had secured their next option, they would suddenly announce their decision to leave with shocking finality. Partners who had been trying to work through what they thought were temporary relationship problems would be blindsided by declarations that the relationship had been dead for months or years. What made this final stage so devastating was its completeness. Women didn't just end relationships, they seemed to erase them emotionally. The scribes noted that women could transition from intimate partnership to cool indifference with breathtaking speed. Former lovers became strangers, shared history became irrelevant, and future contact became unwelcome. The most disturbing aspect of this pattern wasn't its occurrence, but its universality. The scribes found the same 5 stages across all social classes, age groups, and personality types. Gentle women and fierce women, religious women and secular women, educated women and simple women, all followed remarkably similar paths when their partners faced decline. This consistency suggested something deeper than cultural conditioning or individual choice. The scribes began to suspect they were observing biological programming that had evolved over thousands of generations. Women who could quickly identify and attach to successful men would have had tremendous survival advantages throughout human history. The scribes also noticed that this pattern accelerated during periods of social instability. When Egypt faced external threats or internal chaos, women moved through these stages faster and with less hesitation. Crisis seemed to activate ancient survival mechanisms that overrode social conditioning and personal attachment. Understanding this pattern allowed the scribes to predict political developments with startling accuracy. When they noticed elite women entering the criticism phase en masse, they knew that current leadership was in trouble. When women began the comparison phase, they could identify which men were likely to emerge as new powers. The behavior of women became a more reliable political indicator than armies or treasuries. This knowledge was both powerful and dangerous. It revealed uncomfortable truths about female psychology that challenged Egypt's official beliefs about love, loyalty, and human nature itself. 4. Why the priestesses changed sides. The scribes' pattern became even more evident when they turned their attention to Egypt's religious institutions, where the most dramatic betrayals were unfolding. Egyptian priestesses held sacred positions that supposedly transcended earthly concerns like politics and personal relationships. They had taken vows of devotion not just to the gods, but to the eternal principles that kept Egypt strong. Yet even these holy women followed the same predictable patterns when their world began to crumble. Egyptian temples weren't just religious centers, they were the backbone of the entire social system. Priestesses managed vast wealth, controlled agricultural production, and wielded enormous influence over public opinion. Their loyalty to the established order was supposed to be absolute, reinforced by years of training and spiritual discipline. When these women began changing sides, it sent shockwaves through Egyptian society that were felt for generations. The transformation didn't happen overnight. At first, priestesses simply became more critical of current leadership in private conversations. They would question military strategies, economic policies, and diplomatic decisions while still performing their public duties. But the scribes noticed that their criticism always focused on the same theme: the leadership's failure to ensure security and prosperity for Egypt's people. This shift in perspective was crucial because it allowed priestesses to reframe their growing disloyalty as religious duty. They convinced themselves that they weren't abandoning their vows. They were fulfilling them by supporting whoever could best protect Egypt's interests. This mental transformation freed them from guilt while justifying increasingly bold actions. As foreign powers grew stronger and Egyptian authority weakened, priestesses began using their positions to gather intelligence about political developments. They welcomed foreign merchants and diplomats into temple grounds, asking questions about military strength, economic resources, and political intentions. What appeared to be friendly curiosity was actually strategic reconnaissance. The information gathering served multiple purposes. It helped priestesses evaluate which foreign powers were most likely to succeed in conquering Egypt, but it also demonstrated their potential value to those powers. By becoming sources of inside information, priestesses positioned themselves as useful allies rather than potential enemies. The most shocking development came when priestesses began actively communicating with foreign leaders. They sent messages offering cooperation, sharing intelligence about Egyptian defenses, and providing detailed information about internal conflicts. These weren't acts of simple treason. They were calculated investments in future security. What made these communications so effective was the priestesses' deep understanding of Egyptian society. They could provide foreign powers with exactly the information needed to succeed, while causing minimal disruption to temple operations. They knew which nobles were wavering in their loyalty, which military commanders were dissatisfied with current leadership, and which regions were most vulnerable to conquest. The timing of these betrayals revealed the same pattern the scribes had identified in other contexts. Priestesses didn't wait until Egyptian defeat was certain. They began their transitions when they sensed that current leadership was becoming vulnerable. Their early action gave them maximum leverage in negotiations with potential conquerors. When foreign armies finally arrived, many priestesses were ready with detailed proposals for cooperation. They offered to maintain religious continuity, preserve social stability, and provide legitimacy for new rulers. In exchange, they requested protection for temple property, continuation of their religious authority, and personal security for themselves and their families. These negotiations were remarkably successful. Foreign conquerors found that working with established priestesses was far more effective than trying to impose entirely new religious systems. The priestesses' knowledge of local customs, their influence over common people, and their administrative skills made them invaluable partners in governing conquered territory. The most disturbing aspect of these religious betrayals wasn't their occurrence, but their justification. Priestesses genuinely believed they were serving Egypt's highest interests by facilitating smooth transitions to foreign rule. They argued that preserving Egyptian culture and religion under foreign protection was better than watching everything be destroyed in futile resistance. This rationalization revealed something profound about female psychology under pressure. Even women with the strongest possible commitment to abstract principles would abandon those principles when survival was at stake. Their loyalty ultimately belonged not to ideas or institutions, but to whatever offered the best chance of security and continuation. The priestesses' behavior also demonstrated remarkable strategic thinking. They understood that their religious authority would survive political changes only if they made themselves indispensable to new rulers. By positioning themselves as bridges between old and new systems, they ensured their continued relevance and influence. The success of these strategies validated the scribes' observations about female adaptability. Women who could quickly assess changing circumstances and align themselves with emerging powers were far more likely to survive and prosper than those who remained rigidly loyal to failing systems. This pattern among priestesses revealed that even the most sacred vows and intensive spiritual training couldn't override biological programming that prioritized survival over abstract loyalty. The implications of this discovery would haunt Egyptian society until its final collapse. 5. The golden rule of female power. The priestesses' strategic betrayals revealed something the scribes hadn't fully understood until they began analyzing centuries of data together. What emerged wasn't just random behavior during crisis, but a sophisticated survival system that operated according to one fundamental principle. Women, regardless of their social position or personal beliefs, followed what the scribes called the golden rule of female power. They instinctively aligned themselves with whoever could provide the most security and status, regardless of previous commitments or emotional attachments. This wasn't a conscious strategy that women learned or chose to follow. The scribes observed that even women who genuinely loved their partners and desperately wanted to remain loyal would find themselves drawn toward more powerful men when circumstances shifted. It was as if some deep part of their minds constantly evaluated male strength and automatically adjusted their behavior accordingly. The rule operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Women assessed not just immediate power, but future potential. They could sense when a man was losing his edge months before obvious signs appeared. A slight hesitation in decision-making, a moment of uncertainty during public appearances, or small changes in how other men responded to him would trigger subtle shifts in female behavior. This evaluation process was remarkably sophisticated. Women didn't simply choose the most obviously powerful men. They identified those whose power was stable and likely to grow. They could distinguish between men who held temporary positions and those who possessed the personal qualities necessary for long-term success. The scribes noted that women's choices often proved more accurate than expert political analysis. The Golden Rule also explained why women's loyalty seemed so conditional compared to men's. Male bonding was built around shared struggles and mutual sacrifice, creating emotional connections that could survive failure and hardship. Female attachment, however, was fundamentally tied to male performance and status. When that performance declined, the attachment naturally weakened, regardless of previous intimacy or shared history. This difference wasn't a moral failing. It was an evolutionary advantage that had served women well throughout human history. In dangerous, uncertain environments, women who could quickly identify and attach to successful protectors were far more likely to survive and raise healthy children. Those who remained loyal to failing men often faced starvation, violence, or social exclusion. The scribes discovered that this rule operated even in Egypt's most stable periods, but was simply less visible when power structures remained constant. Women married to successful men appeared completely devoted because their natural inclinations aligned with social expectations. The underlying psychology only became obvious when circumstances changed and women faced conflicts between loyalty and survival. Understanding the Golden Rule helped explain why female betrayal felt so shocking to men. Egyptian men had been taught that women's love was similar to their own, based on personal connection and shared experience. They couldn't understand how women could abandon deep relationships so easily because they didn't realize that female attachment was fundamentally different from male bonding. The rule also revealed why women seemed to have such detailed knowledge about other men's qualities and potential. They weren't consciously evaluating alternatives to their current partners, but their minds automatically gathered information about male status and capabilities. This constant background assessment meant they were always prepared to make rapid transitions when necessary. Perhaps most importantly, the Golden Rule explained why these patterns persisted despite cultural training and religious education. Egyptian society invested enormous effort in teaching women about loyalty, devotion, and sacrifice for the greater good. Yet when survival instincts activated, cultural conditioning proved powerless against biological programming that had evolved over thousands of generations. The scribes noted that recognizing this rule didn't make women evil or manipulative. It made them human. Just as men had evolved psychological mechanisms that drove them to compete for status and resources, women had developed complementary systems that helped them identify and secure access to successful men. Both sets of behaviors had been essential for human survival and reproduction. However, understanding the rule also revealed why Egypt's social system was fundamentally unstable. The empire had been built on assumptions about female loyalty that ignored basic psychological realities. When external pressures mounted and male performance declined, women's natural responses accelerated the empire's collapse rather than supporting resistance efforts. The Golden Rule operated with such consistency that the scribes could use it to predict social and political developments with remarkable accuracy. When they noticed elite women beginning to distance themselves from their husbands, they knew that those men's power was already declining, even if external signs weren't yet visible. 6. What Cleopatra really teaches us. The scribe's Golden Rule found its most dramatic illustration in the behavior of Egypt's final great queen, though her story reveals complexities that simple historical accounts completely miss. Most people know about her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, but they understand these connections as romantic love stories or political alliances. The Egyptian records tell a very different story, one that demonstrates the Golden Rule operating at the highest levels of power with deadly precision. When the young woman who would become Egypt's last pharaoh first assessed her situation, she faced an impossible challenge. Egypt was weak, surrounded by enemies, and completely dependent on Roman protection for survival. Her own position was precarious, contested by family members and threatened by internal rebellion. She needed powerful allies, and she needed them quickly. Her first major decision reveals how completely she understood the Golden Rule. Rather than trying to strengthen Egypt independently or seeking help from multiple sources, she identified the single most powerful Roman and made herself indispensable to him. Julius Caesar wasn't just politically dominant, he possessed the personal qualities that suggested his power would continue growing. The relationship that developed wasn't based on physical attraction or emotional connection, despite how historians have portrayed it. The Egyptian records show that she studied Caesar's psychology, identified his weaknesses and desires, then crafted herself into exactly what he needed. She became his perfect complement, intelligent enough to advise him, exotic enough to fascinate him, and powerful enough to enhance his status. This strategic self-transformation required extraordinary discipline and intelligence. She had to suppress her natural personality and adopt behaviors that would appeal to a completely different culture and mindset. The scribes noted that she essentially became a different person when dealing with Romans, switching between Egyptian queen and Roman consort with remarkable skill. When Caesar was assassinated, her response demonstrated the Golden Rule in its purest form. She didn't waste time grieving or seeking revenge. She immediately began evaluating which of Caesar's successors was most likely to emerge victorious. Her analysis led her to Mark Antony, but not for the reasons most people assume. Antony wasn't the strongest of Caesar's heirs initially, but he possessed qualities that suggested he could become dominant if properly supported. He was charismatic, militarily competent, and emotionally accessible in ways that made him easier to influence than his rivals. Most importantly, he controlled territories that complemented Egypt's resources and strategic position. Her relationship with Antony reveals even greater strategic sophistication. She recognized that he needed confidence and validation more than advice or criticism. Where Caesar had valued her intelligence, Antony needed her admiration and support. She adapted her approach completely, becoming nurturing and encouraging rather than challenging and analytical. The Egyptian records show that she genuinely cared for both men, but her emotional investment was always conditional on their continued success and usefulness to Egypt's survival. She could love them deeply, while simultaneously preparing for their potential failure. This emotional flexibility was perhaps her greatest strength and her ultimate limitation. When Antony began losing his struggle with Octavian, her behavior followed the familiar pattern the scribes had documented for centuries. She began questioning his decisions, developing backup plans, and exploring alternative arrangements. Her final betrayal, abandoning him during the crucial naval battle, wasn't impulsive treachery but calculated survival strategy. Her attempted negotiation with Octavian after Antony's defeat reveals how thoroughly she understood the Golden Rule. She offered herself as a potential ally, emphasizing her usefulness as an administrator and symbol of continuity. She was prepared to abandon everything she had claimed to believe in if it meant preserving her life and position. The negotiation failed, not because Octavian rejected the Golden Rule, but because he understood it too well. He recognized that her loyalty would always be conditional and temporary. Rather than accepting her as an ally, he chose to eliminate the threat she represented to future stability. Her final choice, suicide rather than captivity, might seem to contradict the Golden Rule, but it actually demonstrates its ultimate logic. When no path existed that could preserve her power and dignity, she chose to control the terms of her exit rather than accept humiliation and irrelevance. The scribes saw her story as the perfect illustration of both the power and limitations of female strategic thinking. She had successfully navigated impossible circumstances for decades, preserving Egypt's independence far longer than should have been possible. Yet her reliance on male protectors ultimately made her vulnerable to forces beyond her control. Her legacy teaches us that understanding the Golden Rule isn't enough. We must also recognize its boundaries and costs. The same psychological mechanisms that can ensure survival in the short term may create long-term vulnerabilities that determine ultimate failure or success. 7. How to recognize the signs. Today, the ancient patterns the scribes documented didn't disappear when Egypt fell. They simply became harder to see in modern society. But once you understand what the Egyptian observers recorded, you start noticing the same behaviors everywhere around you. The Golden Rule operates today with the same precision it did 4,000 years ago, hidden beneath layers of modern language and social expectations that make it almost invisible to those who don't know what to look for. The first sign appears in language changes that mirror exactly what the scribes observed. Modern women begin using phrases that sound reasonable on the surface, but serve the same function as the criticism phase in ancient Egypt. "I need space to figure things out" translates to "I'm evaluating my options." "We've grown in different directions" means your trajectory looks less promising than alternatives. "I don't feel supported" signals you're not providing the security I need. These aren't conscious deceptions. They're psychological translations that allow women to process their changing feelings without confronting uncomfortable truths about their own motivations. Just like the Egyptian women who reinterpreted their relationships to justify emotional detachment, modern women use socially acceptable language to describe biological responses they can't fully understand or control. The comparison phase shows up in seemingly innocent behavior changes. Women suddenly become more interested in social media, spending time evaluating other people's relationships and lifestyle choices. They develop new interests in activities that put them in contact with different social circles. They become more concerned about their appearance and more critical of their current living situation or lifestyle. This isn't vanity or dissatisfaction. It's unconscious market research. Just as Egyptian women needed to understand their options during political upheaval, modern women instinctively gather information about alternative relationships and opportunities when they sense their current situation might be unstable. The emotional archaeology phase appears as revisionist relationship history. Happy memories get reframed as times when she was settling or not being true to herself. Romantic gestures become evidence of manipulation or love bombing. Shared struggles that once brought couples closer together become proof that we were never really compatible. This psychological rewriting serves the same function it did in ancient Egypt. It makes emotional detachment easier and less guilt-inducing. Women need to convince themselves that their previous happiness wasn't real in order to justify abandoning relationships without feeling like they're betraying their former selves. The positioning phase manifests as strategic distance creation. She starts spending more time with friends and family, develops new hobbies or interests that don't include her partner, or becomes more invested in work or personal projects. She might suggest couples therapy not to save the relationship, but to create a paper trail showing she tried everything. During this phase, modern women also begin subtle communication with potential alternatives. Social media interactions become more frequent and personal with certain men. Professional networking becomes more focused on building relationships with successful males. She might reach out to old friends or connections under the guise of catching up. The clean break phase in modern society often involves dramatic declarations about personal growth and self-discovery. I need to find myself, or I'm focusing on my own journey, are contemporary versions of ancient justifications for abandoning failing partners. The speed and completeness of emotional disconnection remains exactly the same as what the scribes observed thousands of years ago. What makes these patterns particularly difficult to recognize today is how our culture has developed elaborate explanations that obscure their real nature. We talk about falling out of love, growing apart, or wanting different things, as if these are random emotional events rather than predictable responses to changing circumstances. Professional relationship counselors often miss these patterns because they've been trained to treat all relationship problems as communication issues or compatibility mismatches. They don't recognize that they're observing biological programming that operates independently of conscious choice or emotional commitment. The most telling sign is timing. Just as the Egyptian scribes noted that women began their exit strategies before obvious problems emerged, modern women often initiate relationship changes during periods when their partners are facing career challenges, health issues, or other threats to their status and resources. The correlation isn't coincidental, it's the golden rule in action. Understanding these signs doesn't mean that all women are calculating manipulators or that female loyalty is worthless. It means recognizing that human psychology operates according to ancient patterns that don't always align with modern relationship ideals. Women aren't choosing to follow these patterns. They're responding to evolutionary programming that helped our species survive for thousands of generations. The key insight from the Egyptian scribes is that knowledge is power. Men who understand these patterns can make better decisions about relationships, careers, and life planning. Women who recognize their own psychological responses can make more conscious choices about how to handle difficult situations. But perhaps most importantly, understanding these ancient patterns can help us build more realistic expectations about human nature and create relationships and social structures that work with our psychological reality rather than against it. 8. The final lesson of the lost empire. Standing in the ruins of what was once the greatest civilization on Earth, we must ask ourselves the most uncomfortable question of all. Are we repeating Egypt's mistakes? The scribes who documented the patterns of female psychology during their empire's collapse weren't just recording historical curiosities. They were leaving us a warning about human nature that transcends time and culture. The final lesson from Egypt's fall isn't about women being disloyal or men being weak. It's about what happens when entire societies build themselves on beautiful lies about human psychology instead of uncomfortable truths. Egypt fell because it created systems that depended on behaviors that don't actually exist when survival is at stake. Every great civilization faces this same test eventually. Success creates stability, stability creates comfort, and comfort allows people to forget the harsh realities that their ancestors understood. We start believing our own propaganda about love, loyalty, and human nature. We design institutions and relationships based on how we wish people would behave rather than how they actually respond under pressure. Modern society has created even more elaborate myths than ancient Egypt ever did. We tell ourselves that love conquers all, that commitment means ignoring alternatives, and that true partnerships transcend biological programming. We've built entire industries around these beliefs: marriage counseling, relationship coaching, and romantic entertainment that promotes impossible standards. But the same psychological patterns the Egyptian scribes documented are operating all around us right now. Women still respond to declining male status the same way they did 4,000 years ago. Men still fail to recognize these patterns until it's too late. The language has changed, the context has evolved, but the fundamental psychology remains identical. The most dangerous part isn't that these patterns exist, it's that we've made them invisible through social conditioning and wishful thinking. When relationships fail according to the ancient template, everyone involved feels confused and betrayed because no one prepared them for psychological realities that contradict cultural messaging. This willful blindness creates the same cascade effects that destroyed Egypt. When individual relationships fail in predictable ways, trust in the entire social system begins to erode. When trust disappears, cooperation becomes impossible. When cooperation fails, even the strongest civilizations become vulnerable to forces that united societies could easily resist. The scribes understood that knowledge of human psychology wasn't meant to create cynicism or despair. It was meant to create wisdom. Recognizing how people actually behave under pressure allows us to build more realistic expectations and more resilient systems. It helps us distinguish between relationships based on genuine compatibility and those built on temporary circumstances. Perhaps most importantly, understanding these patterns allows us to make peace with human nature rather than fighting against it. The golden rule that governs female psychology isn't evil or wrong. It's a survival mechanism that served our species well throughout history. The same drive that can destroy relationships during good times can also ensure species survival during genuine crises. The real tragedy of Egypt wasn't that women followed their psychological programming, it was that Egyptian society never learned to work with that programming instead of against it. They created expectations that couldn't survive contact with reality, then expressed shock when reality won. We have the opportunity to learn from their mistake. We can acknowledge uncomfortable truths about human psychology without becoming bitter or cynical. We can build relationships and social structures that account for how people actually behave rather than how we wish they would behave. The scribes left us more than just observations about ancient history. They left us a mirror that shows us ourselves with painful clarity. Whether we choose to look honestly at what that mirror reveals or continue living in comfortable illusions will determine whether our civilization learns from Egypt's fall or repeats it. The choice is ours, but the patterns are eternal. The question isn't whether we'll face the same pressures that destroyed Egypt. It's whether we'll be wise enough to see them coming and strong enough to survive them when they arrive. In the end, the greatest lesson from the lost empire isn't about women or men. It's about the price of ignoring truth in favor of beautiful lies. That price, as Egypt learned too late, is everything we think we've built to last forever.